All right, got it. Okay, 10 seconds. And we're going to be running late.
You've got it till 6.
Yeah, but I'm going to have to get that other program. So I'm really glad we got together. I'm telling you, you must have. How long were you with him? I mean, over, would you say?
Since the 40 years.
Wow, that's really something.
I mean, I first met him in the 50s, and then I got more involved in the 60s, and then in the 70s.
What a privileged person to be near. I mean, privileged to be near such a person. Yeah.
No, the intensity was very exciting and challenging.
Welcome. Welcome very much to Conversations. We've got where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Bob Dobbs. And Bob Dobbs is a man who worked closely, we were just chatting, for something like 40 years with one of the intellectual giants of our time, Marshall McLuhan, and it has been recognized as Marshall McLuhan's archivist, which is an incredibly important role to have in this society, and we're going to talk about that. And Bob, welcome really very, very much to Conversations and Manhattan Network.
Good to be here, Harold. I saw you 2 years ago at the McLuhan Symposium at Fordham.
Right. That's coming up again now,
yeah,
because this is now James Joyce Day. They're going to be reading from the Wake tomorrow uptown, right?
Yep, at
and
Fordham.
He was a great admirer of the Wake, you know. I know that, and James Joyce.
Well, McLuhan considered that he applied Joyce. All his writings, which are his artistic part of himself, were a translation of Finnegan's Wake.
Yes, right.
A translation.
Right, right. Well, anyway, we're going to be talking about that,
yes.
And you had the pleasure of working, in honor of working with such a giant. But I wonder, maybe you could, let's ground it if we could at the very beginning yourself. Maybe share your own background and then weave it into how you came to be in touch with this man, and then we could talk about matters. We're going to have a couple roll-in clips of him and so forth. So
yes. I had a unique upbringing. I was a son of a butler for very wealthy people in Europe. And so
in England or in
France?
In France,
in Paris.
Right.
And the circumstances were that in the 40s and 50s, there needed to be a lot of private communications between other wealthy people around the world. And I was a gopher within that scene and was involved with intelligence work, but it wasn't with any nation. It was an international historical group.
That can be even more important. You get some of those
it was
close-knit communities.
Yes, it's the charm circle, as McLuhan would call it. The charm circle.
Right.
And the point is, they represent that historical medium since the Gutenberg press of money, gold, and credit. All this historical trust fund. And that is what I was born into. But I didn't do well in that area in the 50s, so I was banned, sort of, exiled to feel out Canada, which didn't seem to be too important at that point. And it was then in Canada that I met Marshall McLuhan.
Cashiered from Europe.
Yes, and then I had to study pop culture, and I found Marshall, and his work in the magazine Explorations was very interesting.
You said you had to study pulp culture? You came to study pulp culture? How did you study pulp culture?
Well, that was
and
part
why?
of it. That was part of the intelligence work, was for me to understand the changes going on in America, because it was becoming, obviously, the American second half century, so to speak. And the European people that I represented didn't understand American changes in the 50s.
And it was important that they do, because it had political, economic, and social significance.
Well, it became the information society.
All right.
Culture became our business. It was a high and low merged.
Right, okay.
And so even though I was kicked out in terms of, exiled in terms of the old hardware issues, the software issues put me in the front again.
Okay.
And it was with McLuhan that I learned a lot quickly.
Can you remember when first you met this giant?
Oh, yes.
Yes. When was it? Could you describe?
Well, that was in 1954.
Wow, that goes way back.
Oh, yeah. I'm a lot older than I look, but that's another issue.
You look very good. You must be living a good, clean life.
I have a very good wife who's a good doctor.
Lucky for you. Yeah, anyway. But
the point is that he published an essay in the first Explorations in December '53, which kind of exposed the way the people I represented looked at the world.
I see.
And McLuhan had studied secret societies in the 40s and 50s, so he understood that. But he came up with a new perspective that showed the obsolescence of secret societies.
I see.
So I was fortunate to meet him, and I was asked to check him out once this issue came out in 1954. And then I just kept in touch and was an interloper, drop in, meet him. I didn't go to the classes. I just was a businessman who would come by and talk to him.
Was this in Toronto?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he had been in Toronto from Winnipeg.
Yeah, this is before he started. The center starts in 1963.
The Center for Culture and Technology.
Yeah, this is at St. Michael's College, at his office there in the 50s.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And then he gets his center in 63, thanks to Claude Bissell.
That great old carriage house.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been there.
Not the carriage house.
Not the carriage house.
No, he just had his own office.
Oh, I see.
The year he went to Fordham in 67, 68, when he came back, he was given the coach house.
Yeah, because by then he'd become an icon.
That's
in
right.
the pop culture and otherwise, in intellectual circles. Yeah. Right.
So
But you can remember the circumstances of the first meeting and so forth? And did he impress you from the get-go? He was an intellectual giant.
we didn't know anything about his literary criticism, which was stunning in the 40s.
It was indeed, yeah.
And if you followed it, in retrospect, I went back and read it, and that's how I became his archivist. It was a means of going back and reading everything he wrote, and it's littered all over the place, especially in a journal called Renaissance, and following those articles. Then I saw what the background of this man was. And then that helped me understand him by the late 50s, early 60s. But when I first met him, I just was curious about pop culture and why was he talking as a professor of English about Elvis and things like that.
Yes,
this was strange.
Yeah,
you know, it was out of the, you didn't have that highbrow, lowbrow mixture.
Yeah, right.
And then took years to understand him, but my own experience and the difficulties in the intelligence work demanded me to hurry up and understand what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, so were you in an official position or an unofficial position?
In relation to him?
Yeah, in relation to him in these
I was
early
just
years.
a friend.
You were just a friend. You became friends. But you would have a cup of coffee or beer or something like that? Or?
Yeah, but Monley just dropped into his office where he was available.
Right.
See, McLuhan was very well known.
What an honor.
In Toronto by 1950.
Right.
Journalists, everybody dropped in on him. He was a local character.
Right, right.
Good for media columns and newspaper articles, and so there was always people dropping out. That's why he was not just an academic.
Right,
he was a businessman. He was interested in inventions. He was interested in being a force in the community. So
he was a comprehensivist and a Renaissance man in a certain sense. Understanding this new information environment that's evolving in a unique kind of way, and was absolutely masterfully able to talk to that through metaphor and other kinds of ways to get a hold of a big picture.
Because his PhD thesis was on the Elizabethan period, and so he was an expert in that, and then he saw how the 20th century was retrieving the Elizabethan sensibility, but in a grander multimedia sense. So he was prepared in his own studies at Cambridge to understand the middle of the century.
From the time you met him, 54 and so forth, was he on track for understanding, like, I don't know, it was Mechanical Bride? Or
Mechanical Bride came out 51.
51. It had been out, but was he on to doing what was to come out in the major work, or the one that became so popular?
Right.
The Medium is a Message.
I have an exclusive for you.
Yes, okay, good.
His first PhD student, Donald Thiel, who became president of Trent University in Ontario in the 80s, he came up from Yale, having studied with Marshall's friends at Yale English Department, Clent Brooks and Wimsatt, who had Marshall's PhD thesis. And he took a course from Ted Carpenter, who was in anthropology. He then handed to McLuhan, Donald Thiel, a book, Cybernetics by Norbert Wiener. And a book by Bateson.
Gregory Bateson.
And Reutsch, which was called Communication, the Social Matrix of Psychiatry. These two books were handed to Marshall by his first PhD student, just fresh from Yale, in 1950 in the fall.
Wow.
He was tired of the Mechanical Bride that was coming out in a few months in 51. He was looking for a new area, and these books created a target for him. He said, we're going to go after the MIT boys, and we're going to study culture and communications. And then he made the Ford Foundation grant in 52, and then they created the journal, and that took off. And that was begun with Ted Carpenter, Don Thiel, and McLuhan. Yeah,
and he was having an affair, as it were, with the pop culture that was beginning to emerge. He'd come up into that period. But he was a very, very serious academic, literary scholar.
Oh.
Absolutely.
He made great breakthroughs.
And his brain was wired in a kind of unique kind of way, I think, you know.
He was the first to really understand what Joyce was doing with Finnegan's Wake. And McLuhan stood on the shoulders of Joyce and became the greatest poet, I say, greatest scientist, and almost the greatest economist of the second half of the 20th century. Now, I'm willing to debate that with you on the economics level. But
I didn't realize that he had an understanding. I know he had written about my man Kelso.
Yes.
He'd written, but he had said he had a ball reading this metaphoric something or other. But I didn't know that he was that interested in economics.
Here's the way it works.
Interesting.
He cracks the mystery, the oracle of the first half of the 20th century, James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. He cracks that by 1950. He then cracks the importance of Wiener's cybernetics and the New Information Society, and then he also cracks the importance of Harold Innis, the importance of Innis in political economy, that Innis understood that we were moving from what Innis called the old trade routes of furs and industry and fish and cod to the trade routes of the mind. And Innis lays out in his books, like
Harold Innis
lays lays out the impact of radio on World War II,
Right.
the impact of newspaper on earlier periods, and he was just beginning to see the impact of television on economics and how
Yeah.
it was going to create a new economic society. And McLuhan then took the ball and ran with it.
Yeah.
So he was operating as a scientist because he was also dealing with modern physics.
Right.
But he was creating a new context. That's why his last book is called The New Science.
I didn't realize. Yeah, okay.
And
yeah.
he is finding a framework that moves science out of what he called the Newtonian and moved it out of the Einsteinian and moved into a post-quantum science.
Yeah,
Now, this is not known about Marshall. So that's just in the scientists. Then he was an economist, and he had recommendations on how to control inflation. And then he also was an expert on literature, which was his first love, and he always wrote on that anyways.
Yeah.
And then he was aware of the arts and new developments in pop culture.
Yeah,
So
I had a
everything.
great admiration for he and another great systems, you know, was Buckminster Fuller at the time. They were, you know, Fuller was a little bit older and so forth and that sort of thing. I had an admiration for the two of them, but I always thought if there was a grounding in that, it would have been literature. But you tell me he's got this interest in that, you know, in the economic implications.
He understood.
emerging. Yeah, that's interesting.
See, he understood from the symbolists,
Yeah.
who, like Mallarmé and Baudelaire, that they knew that technology was determining people's sensibility.
Okay.
It began with the photograph and
Right.
the telegraph.
Right.
And so the book people, the traditional fine arts culture, were obsolete.
Yeah.
And Marshall learned this from Pound and Eliot and Joyce, and then he applied it to a larger situation where even the movies and radio content was obsolete once you moved into an automated society,
Right.
which the speed up of that, which people couldn't see then and is obvious now, was happening in the 50s.
Well, I'm not so sure it's all that obvious now because I don't think we've really, I don't know, for whatever it's worth, I don't think we've gotten into the full-fledged automated process because we're still favoring systems of labor distribution of income and sort of thing. And there's an automated process that I think is yet before us. It's going
Right.
to speed up. I mean, now with nanotechnology and things that are coming, he would have had a ball with the
He predicted
situation
that.
that existed now.
He mentions
Yeah.
this stuff. He says, he wrote an article for Maclean's magazine, a Canadian magazine in 1967 at Christmas,
Great
saying,
magazine, yeah.
in the future we will look up at the Star of Bethlehem and it will be man-made.
Yes.
That's pretty science fiction.
He was pretty. He was pretty. Well, there's going to be so much to talk about him. But one of the things I want to make sure we do, we got a couple tapes, right? That you
Yes.
brought in, and you've got this first tape. Maybe you could set it up, as they
Yes.
say, what it is, what the context is, and we ask people to live with it because it's like live with a little graininess perhaps that's
Yes.
in it. But it's an older tape, 40 years old or something like that.
1964.
But you set up this piece about 4 minutes long or so that we're going to 4 to 5
Yes.
minutes long that we're going to look at and see now.
Right.
if you
What
could.
happened was Understanding Media comes out in 1964.
Okay.
Because that dealt more with pop culture than Gutenberg-Gaussy in 62, which he won the Governor General's War, but that was within academia. But here's Understanding Media. It gets a lot of publicity in 64, so the documentarians of Canadian Society, the National Film Board,
Yeah.
decides to go to his office and interview him. So here you see the Center for Culture and Technology,
Yeah.
which is just a bookcase,
Yeah.
and himself. And
So
you
we didn't have the carriage house.
no,
then,
that's
yeah.
in 68.
Okay.
And so here he is with just his own office, and he's being confronted. This is the beginning of the media interrogation of
Yes,
him.
right,
He
right.
called them psychiatric interviews, where they come around and say, what do you really mean? And you'll see he's quite, doesn't look friendly.
Yes, right.
That's because his secret cultural hero is Wyndham Lewis, who wrote this journal called The Enemy. And Marshall often said that he considered his relationship to the General Society as one like the enemy.
I see, I
So
see,
you will
right.
see this in this.
And
so
he had a wonderful sense of humor. didn't
all
he?
on top of
I
that.
mean,
The important thing is that what Marshall was an actor. He is acting a certain way in this context, in this medium, documentary
because he
form,
knows who he's dealing with.
who he's dealing with, and he wants to create a certain effect.
Okay, well,
Okay.
maybe we could set that up in the studio. Then it runs about 4 or 5 minutes. We'll set that up, and we're talking now with Bob Dobbs, an archivist of this intellectual giant, Marshall McLuhan. Set up that and run that in the studio now, then, please. Thank you.
Of leisurely historical perspective, habits of classifying youth and age and various kinds of experience in large blueprints and so on. This circuitry is terribly upsetting. It messes up all the categories.
Now, I know that you're famous for analogies to the sort of holding backness of print. In your book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, and subsequent books, you sort of laid our stodginess, or our inability to move quickly or move to the changes because our orientation to print. Could you explain that for me?
Well, print was a great improvement of the older alphabetic writing. Print is a technology not only of movable types and of the first mechanization of a handicraft, it had all the startling implications that automation now has for us with regard to the reorganizing of work. Print reorganized the work pattern by specialism. Instead of a man knowing all aspects of his craft, he learned one operation only. And work was broken up into bits. Humpty Dumpty literally fell off the wall with print, and the types were scattered hither and thither. But print also created a new environment. Any technology creates a new environment, a new set of relationships among people. Print created the public. Before printing, no kind of handwriting was capable of creating a public. It wasn't strong enough or powerful enough technologically to create what is called a public. With print came into existence for the first time in human history the public. With electric technology, the public disappears into what is now called, somewhat unhappily, the mass audience. Now, the mass is a group of people who are totally involved in each other. They don't have the simple classified status of people sitting in rows in seats or in rows of desks in classrooms, as far as that goes. The mass audience is one of instant circuitry and involvement, and its boundaries are not national at all. They don't have the same characteristic patterns as the old publics. So we're living simultaneously with that old technology and with this new technology, but print, and this is confusing, but print had this amazing power to create in a new environment called the public. And politically and educationally, this was a tremendous revolution. They're just trying to get it started in China now.
Just to go back to the public again for a moment, when you say that the public is given way to the mass, let us say through television, if everyone is sharing a television experience, they are involved with one another, therefore?
No. Senator Lodge on TV the other day was explaining now, in Indonesia, of course, there is no nationalism, there is no nation. He said, but there is peopleness. Before there are publics, you have the tribal mass. Everybody, a relative of everybody, everybody involved in depth in everybody. And with writing and then printing came the separating out of the individual from that amorphous mass. And there was
classification of people, just like there was classification of information.
The whole power of this type of technology permitted classification of cards of identity, passports, individualism, and so after centuries of customation to such classified individual entities and private patterns of organizing oneself and knowledge, it is terribly confusing to be thrust back into the amorphous tribal mass of complete human interdependence and interinvolvement. But this simply happens, and I think that we should notice that we are doing it to ourselves. Nobody is doing it to us, and therefore to lament about what we choose to do to ourselves is a slightly useless gesture. I don't lament, I don't make any value judgments about these changes. I just feel that it's very urgent to understand what's happening so that we may take action if we choose to take action.
Right.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting. He was there. What year again was this thing?
1964.
That was just when he was hitting his peak, right? As far as the popular recognition of him, he was?
That was before it. He doesn't really get popular till 65 when Tom Wolfe writes about him here in New York.
Right.
And then he's invited to speak in New York in 66. And then 67 is when he does the little black book, The Medium is the Massage.
Right.
But this is when he doesn't know himself that he's going to become a big icon at that point. So he's just dealing with these journalists who he probably knew around Toronto.
What would you say, if you were saying him as a contributor to our understanding media and all of the questions of the evolution of universal consciousness and so forth, Gutenberg Galaxy was an absolute tour de force, it seems to me. Understanding media was in another vein, or where was he? And can you help straighten us out there? And which would have been his magnus opus, do you think, if it's fair to say?
Okay, the magnum opus theme is this. He understood that at electronic information speeds, that art, science, and nature converge.
That's right, yeah.
Then he says through understanding media. In other words, That means you have to understand why they converge.
Right.
They do converge, but if you don't understand why, then you wouldn't notice it.
Okay.
So we understood, these are big memes, art, science, and nature.
Memes, that's right. Ding, ding,
and he's saying they converge.
Yeah.
So that is what he sees, and Finnegan's Wake has spelled that out.
Yeah, right.
Now you're asking, what's his magnum opus? The magnum opus was him attempting to communicate this, which was impossible.
No, but I mean in terms of the literary output that he had.
Okay.
Output.
You got two
the
McLuhans.
Gutenberg Galaxy was a tour de force.
Right, but you got two McLuhans here. You've got McLuhan, the poet, and I think he was the greatest poet of the second half of the century, and you have McLuhan, the scientist.
Okay, yeah.
The books, like the Gutenberg Galaxy, Understand Media, are efforts in the world of literature and book culture.
Okay.
They're a small part, and they have a satirical intent.
Oh, absolutely. Everything was viewed with a satirical, you know, metaphoric.
Now here's how he did a satire. It's who he addressed the books to. Gutenberg Galaxy is addressed to academia. So he wins the Governors General's Award, and he emphasizes Harold Innis as a academic star of Canada that he could stand on the shoulders of. But then Understanding Media is geared to the world in general, and so that has a whole different slant. And you can't say one's better than the other, or tour de force, unless you're thinking of the audiences they're geared for.
He came out with this idea of phonetic literacy as being an organizing metaphor for Western civilization, and this idea of linear space and linear thinking coming out of primarily the adoption of the phonetic alphabet.
That was the key point.
And that we're now coming and closing, you know, we're now reestablishing and that there was a disequilibrium in terms of the extension of our media, of our sensory capability, and we're closing quotes on that. But this idea of literacy, because there was a clash between literacy and electronic environments that were coming, that was a major force. It was hard for people to understand because we have a tremendous commitment to the linear concept of social and all kinds of organization. Or maybe you could address yourself to that large theme of the phonetic alphabet and how important that was for the organizing principles of what we call Western civilization, even our ideas of what is rationality.
That's right.
In some cases.
That's right. The phrase in Finnegan's Wake is all for a bit, which is a pun on the alphabet.
Okay.
So the phonetic alphabet, at the time of Socrates, isolates the vowels from the consonants. Before that, you have writing, and it's visual space, as McLuhan called it, but it's intertwined the consonants and the vowels. When you isolate the vowels, you create this abstract void, this vacuum, and that was the beginning of what he called the visual space effect of the phonetic alphabet. And then you have the geometers, Euclid and the boys, coming in trying to fill in that vacuum and put order to it. Now that collapses when the Roman Empire moves in with the larger environment of papyrus and roads. That collapses when Egypt pulls the papyrus sources away. So you go into the Dark Ages, what are called the Dark Ages. When the printing press comes in, that rekindles the phonetic alphabet effect, but also it moves it beyond just a Greek culture to the whole world. And that was a mechanization of the phonetic alphabet. Now the key point about the antithesis of the phonetic alphabet in the 20th century is when the telegraph comes in. The telegraph is an electric event, a biological event, Teilhard de Chardin said. And that event wipes out, subsumes the visual space, this abstract Western rationality that was created from the Greeks and the Romans with the phonetic alphabet, but expanded around the world with the printing press.
Homer said that you didn't have an alphabet you didn't want to write down, was going to create forgetfulness in the learner's mind.
Right. Well, that's
the audio
Plato.
Space out of
that's
Plato?
In the Phaedrus, I think.
Yeah, right. But it was coming out of that's an important concept in and of itself. I mean, and we're getting back to acoustic space and also to a multi-sensory sensory involvement with the environment about us.
What I'd like to add to that, that's right, but most people thought it was a retrieval of oral culture through electronics in contradistinction to the visual book culture.
Which had been so much tied up with the phonetic alphabet and linear thinking as the basis of rationality even.
What people didn't understand was that tactility is what was extended with electric telegraph and radio and television and the telephone. The tactility is all the senses, the cohering of all the senses. So
there's a space. It's not tactility isn't just touch. There's a resonancy.
That's right. The
gap. So back to resonancy of all the multi-sensuous involvement which we were in Eden. We would have been multi-sensuously involved with the environment all at once, and that's an environment that's a consciousness that we're recapturing at the end of this cycle, having been the human experience.
Right. But here's the situation: when tactility comes in, the content extent of the tactile TV environment is a battle between the old visual book culture and the new oral pop culture. But what is really molding people is the tactile mesh of the TV screen. And that is what makes both visual culture anemic and pop culture anemic, in the sense that it always has a turnover, and nobody can hold the iconic stature like you could in the visual space cultures before. But then, the reason that understanding media and Gutenberg Galaxy have a Menippean point is that McLuhan understands that the computer and the satellite were there from 57 on, from Sputnik on.
Well, they're coming with a new force.
A new force that would actually bring back personal autonomy in relation to these historical big media forces. And television was the end of that process, because it extended living consciousness or tactility. But when you have the satellite and computer taking you out, then you have the freedom and the anarchy and libertarianism of the 60s happening. And then what happens? The instant replay comes in. And most people haven't seen Marshall's writings on that, but the instant replay, McLuhan said, was the most devastating metaphysical shock to humans that ever had happened, because the instant replay gave you the meaning before the experience that had never happened before.
Like the Queen of Hearts.
Right, and so that stopped the space program in the 70s. It brought in sports and allowed, in American culture, for football to reign supreme for the last 30 years, because television was the best medium to do the instant replay on.
It was a happening,
It was an electronic post-happening. You couldn't get your sense of real time. Now we have the chip economy and the chip media. That puts us in a dream world, a hallucination world, which is actually, I say, and McLuhan I think would agree, that is technology extending itself, not extending our senses anymore. Technology up to television extended our senses. But then since television is an extension of consciousness itself, it takes on a life of its own with the computer and the chip.
That's really, I should think, what year again did he die? I've forgotten.
1980. 3 weeks after John Lennon for local culture.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. And would he not, I'm just trying to project, and he was a giant, and so he would have an absolute ball with what's going on now in this world 20 years after his passing, with the internet and all these kind of things that are going on.
You know what he would do?
Where's Marshall McLuhan? Where are you, Marshall McLuhan, now that we need you to understand this evolving new situation?
Well, we do have his books.
Yes, we do. But I would wouldn't it be?
Well, here's what he would say. I'll tell you, I'll go on the limb. He would say, yes, I would create a web page. In other words, he would go into the democratic impulse of the internet where everybody has access to you. But he would say he'd get James Joyce to write the instruction on how to find it. Therefore, maintaining that citadel, that private citadel of consciousness, that academic tradition which he represented. He was a conservative up to a point, and that was there.
And but catholico.
Beg your pardon?
He was very Catholic.
Oh,
absolutely.
Now, I want to say something about this Catholicism. A lot is made out of it, and he knew not to talk about it in public, because he knew he was a discarnate image on the media. His private preferences, his personal religion was not relevant when he was communicating to media, to people all over the world on television, like when he's on David Frost or something, or like we're here. We're communicating to many minds. He wouldn't bring that in. But actually, people who knew him very well, like his assistant George Thompson, said McLuhan wasn't even a Catholic. That was an anti-environment to the discarnate state of the electric media. He said that it was the only religious doctrine that was founded in the flesh. The rest were all involved with transcendence to other dimensions, Buddhism, that. So because Christianity was anchored in the flesh, and this was the temple, he considered that was the proper anti-environment, here's the enemy role, anti-environment to the disembodied effect from the telegraph on. So he used his Catholicism as an art form.
Telegraph on being an electronic kind of
electronic environment that made you, that sent you as well as whatever you were sending or emitting. It sent you, when you're on the telephone, you're in two places at once or more.
He had this concept, he had this concept of hot and cool, and he had this concept of the media were extensions of one of our sensory capabilities, and they were like the radio was or sound was an extension of the ear, visual was an extension of the eye, the print and so forth. Can you address that a little bit? And then back to the idea of what happens when we begin to get to the point where the media is being is extending. Are we getting back to where we're getting a multi-sensuous involvement with the environment and the tactility, which is the resonancy, and that we're closing process that began when first we came out of Eden, perhaps, by the sophistication of the technological extensions and we have parallel processing in computers
Right,
now.
so let me address the
It's coming into where we're closing quotes on
Right,
the human experience in a certain sense.
The McLuhan's basic doctrine was Thomistic. And Thomas Aquinas had a doctrine that the analogical proportions among the senses from moment to moment, the changes of the ratio of the senses in our experiencing of life from moment to moment, that doctrine was the most appropriate for understanding the extensions of those senses, the modern media, and all the media, but especially the modern media, which have such an ongoing live, moment-to-moment content, encyclopedic content, and involves all the senses, which is tactility. The fact that the moment-to-moment changing of the senses, that awareness of that process, is what he said we needed to develop. You couldn't get that if you were alphabetic. You couldn't get that if you were acoustic even.
Well, because that would be high definition, hot, medium, high, and high definition.
Those were two hot
definitions. One of our sensory capabilities. Hitler could never survive the television age. He used to use that analogy, and it probably was true. I mean, it created a different sensory relationship.
Aquinas was a cool doctrine.
Okay.
And therefore it was more appropriate for the cool environment of television. Hot media, from the book, the newspaper, movie to the radio, would not have any real constitutive effect on people's sensibility like television did. Now you talk about where do we get now. If you take the idea that the satellite has creates the image of a person like an astronaut floating around the planet and all the media on the global stage, then there's an autonomy from these historical shaping factors. And the effect of the satellite was to create a sense of the people recovering their bodies, individual, and having control over them. That is the hidden dynamics in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that is getting back to the Garden of Eden in the sense that you are not conditioned by the tree of knowledge, which creates an environment, a fig leaf, which is clothing, which numbs your collective perceptions.
Yeah, that's interesting, because he had that idea the extension is a numbing effect upon the thing that is being extended.
And when you have satellite come in with Sputnik, that is a medium that encourages people to think they are not numbed anymore by TV, radio, movie, and newspapers that came before. So electric autonomy was the eureka that McLuhan saw, but it would only be a eureka if you understood the satellite enabled you to have that.
Satellite and computer, because they're extensions of our central nervous system in a certain sense. You know,
they extend the faculties in particular parts of the central nervous system.
I wonder if I could fall back on a thing, and I wanted to try and bring that 20-year gap between his passing and now, because a great deal is going on, and it's going on exponentially. These developments.
But it's best to understand that it's a period where the technology comes alive and replays the stages from the Garden of Eden to television and does it in its own world. And we're sitting on the sidelines while this invades us, and yet is not communicating to us, is just using us.
Well, I'm going to try to get to a kind of metaphor or something that might be able to fill in some of what's going on since 1980 to now, because there are lots going on, and it's going on at light speed. And I mean, if you take Michener and a literate culture, and Michener writes in terms of Hawaii.
Who's Michener?
Michener.
Oh, James Michener,
the popular writer, right? He writes. And he's literary. He's beautiful to describe, and he'll take 8 pages of literary extension of a man standing on a cliff in Hawaii, and he will take 8 pages to describe the wind is blowing, the bird is in the sky, the trees.
The old literary landscape.
Yeah, and it took 8 pages to describe what, if you were standing there, you would experience in a moment, all at once, multisensuously. Now
you can virtually plant that in your head soon. That whole scene.
Well, that's coming with the technology, and particularly with the sophistication of the nanotechnologies and the sophistication of the computing, which is tied into
the miniaturization.
Well, the miniaturization is coming, and they got computing down at the molecular level and so forth now. But it's getting down to the point where we're with parallel processing, they're going to be having perceptions and body comparable to body perception, something which is in a certain sense so developed that it'll be almost all at once.
It's more than that. The phrase is they're cloning ESP.
Wow, okay.
Cloning ESP. McLuhan had an essay in one of the explorations in 1957, Electronics as ESP. He understood that when we talk about television extending our central nervous system, it's extending the process of cognition, the process of knowing. In other words, it's a head that's taking in data like you are right now. So that's extended. Now, if you start refining that with the chip technology, miniaturization, you start to get the connections, subtle connections between 2 heads of TV, and that's ESP, and it's being cloned. simulate it.
Yeah.
So the intimacy is beyond what you just said. It is interaction within the machines of ESP.
Well, yeah, that's right. And these expert systems over these things are going to turn loose on them. So you read some of Ray Kurzweil's stuff and everything.
Yes.
It's going to have a life of its own.
It always
and
does.
Was he in a? You were close with him. What an honor to have been close to such an intellectual giant. But was he extending his view out in terms of
he
where
understood
the
Kurzweil's scenario.
Yeah, okay.
He said that the spiritualization machines would create a great retrieval of Gnostic doctrines, which we call the New Age. He predicted the New Age fad. But he said this would lack real awareness of what he created, which was media yoga. How do you define your identity and your relationship to others and even to machines when the machine has taken on a life of its own and is cloning ESP? This threatens all cognition, and I would say that's why the 90s are called the dumbing down, the celebration of being stupid. The young kids wear their baseball hats backward, celebrate Beavis and Butthead, because the only way to counter a very omniscient cloned ESP environment is to pretend you're stupid.
Yeah, right.
That's the end environment.
Right.
So,
or maybe because the transformation that's occurring in a, I don't know, overworked paradigm, or in some sort of a sense that if you and I were, trippingly, we said we were in Eden's embrace 200,000 years ago or so, and we're coming to the end of the human experience.
Yes, right.
In terms of the extension of our capability, that's a big paradigm shift that we're about to be going through in terms of the evolution of universal consciousness. And it's hard to get your arms around such a big thing, and so people will retreat.
Well,
in
you can't use your
to keep their identity.
Don't use the phrases of any of your arms around. It is inside you.
You're right. You're right.
It's growing inside you.
Right.
It may be cancerous. It may be ecstatic.
Yeah, right.
McLuhan understands.
It's a synergistic world, Mr. Fuller said we lived in.
So what's the anti-environment to all that situation?
Yeah, right.
It's the book, but it's a book that's multi-leveled. Finnegan's Wake. So Finnegan's Wake was the anti-environment to this convergence of media.
He really had a love affair with Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, it was the solution.
Thank God for
he
Finnegan's
considered
Wake.
Finnegan's Wake more important than Einstein's breakthrough.
Right.
Because technology was taking on a life of its own. Scientists would invent new wonderful things, but for the average human in community, it would be irrelevant because the effects would be wiping out their identity. So the real act of science was to retrieve the humanistic vision and offer an anti-environment to that, and that was Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah, right.
Because that shows you all potentialities of cloned ESP in that book. You've got to use ESP to read it.
Yes, right.
You know,
they're going to be reading it uptown tomorrow, right?
That's
God
right.
bless them. Yeah, right.
So the important point is that he said that Finnegan's Wake meant the individual is going to recover autonomy if it has the guts to acquire consciousness of the modes that have happened in history. And the important point is that we don't want to emphasize the media taking over us, because it's not taking us over anymore, it's taking itself over. But it does leave a problem for speech and regular human media. How do they relate to that?
Yeah, and it relates in terms of that notion of irrational, of linear thinking and so forth, and the principle of the establishment of so much of our institutional structures.
Take
Top-down
economics.
Authoritarian, economics.
Take the
absolutely.
trillion-dollar soundbite economy now.
Right.
That is a life of its own.
Right.
It has no respecting of communities or historical tradition.
Right.
But it also creates wealth everywhere in a certain way that people want to swim in, but it's a wealth of information, and the information environment can't be bought, sold, or stolen. That's the paradox. Money cannot measure the situation
and
anymore.
you just said on the computer, instead of 1, you said 12. So I mean, it begins to bring into question the whole notion of scarcity, and as written as a result.
Howard Hughes cannot own this. No one can own for this system for themselves.
Yeah. So a lot of traditional notions of what is real and true and forever true notions and so forth are being challenged by the time in which we live.
This is where
he would have had a
This
ball.
is where your friend Kelso comes in.
Yeah,
if money is obsolete
Yeah.
and it's the only link for our sense of human community, it actually flips into not being an evil but a service. So the guaranteed income might be a necessary product that's being floated now.
Well, some sort of a tradition, some sort of a challenge to traditional notions of what is economics.
Right, because economics does not measure wealth anymore.
But that does not sit well with our the assumptions of our established institutions.
Our Western identity.
Yeah,
our identity is based on private space, and if
we're
you're
trying
invaded,
and we're trying to set that up around the world,
which is natural.
Yeah.
I mean, no, it's natural to have for us our identity, and the technology has made us be the avant-garde of that. But yes, we're not willing to look at the effects.
and we haven't got a proper economic assumption or economic theory even or system, much less policy, that is really relevant to the future that's evolving, even though we think that we do.
Right, and this is where McLuhan, I say, is a great economist. He said real economists, and Barry Nevitt wrote books on this, his colleague, they did a great book called Take Today, the Executive's Dropout.
Yes, right.
That book lays out that real economics requires a visionary who will define the situation we are in now beyond economic terms, because
Yeah.
economic terms don't do this. Now, they did that 30 years ago.
Yeah.
You have a situation now where the institutions are giving money away to the internet developers because it's the identity crisis of these big old institutions want to get involved, and the best way is to give people money. But
can't
that
help-
is not dealing with what we're involved in.
Yeah, it's larger. Hey, I can't help but think, and I, in a certain lament, that Marshall McLuhan could not have lived to see the turn of this millennium at this time, because so
You
much has
lament that
happened.
he could not
I wish
be
he
here.
were here. I wish he could be just swimming around.
Well,
and having a
I'll tell
ball.
you, I'm so knowledgeable on this stuff, I'll fill in.
Okay, you fill in for him. Well, somebody's got to pick up the ball.
Yeah, I'm picking up the
Could
ball.
you talk a little? We got another clip we want to make sure we
Right,
get in.
we
but
got
could you
time for
well, yeah, we'll have time. But you have to, the relationship between he and another great giant, in my view, in any sense. You mentioned Chardin. That's a big, large view of evolution of consciousness. But Fuller.
Yes.
Buckminster Fuller. He had an admiration of Buckminster Fuller, and they did have some communication. and
Oh,
so
they were
forth,
good
and
friends.
You were so close with him. Maybe you could
at
fill us in on that.
At McLuhan's famous address, I think it was at Buffalo in 1965, called the Vision Conference, Bucky Fuller was in the audience, and Marshall made this extraordinary talk dealing with economics and these themes. But then at the end, he said, "I'm humbled to see in the audience Mr. Fuller."
Yeah.
But here's how it goes back. Many people think that the phrase "extensions of man" Fuller developed, and McLuhan got it from there. Now, that could be tracked by people who don't know that McLuhan got it from Joyce and Wyndham Lewis.
Right.
But when McLuhan was in the United States, he would, in that context, say, yes, Mr. Fuller was who I got it from. But here's the point. McLuhan, in Take Today, calls Bucky Fuller a genial, generous person who, if he was given control of the world computerized economy, would probably do okay. But he said McLuhan said that Bucky was essentially a 19th century man and did not understand the real effects of the information environment. So he felt that he had gone past Bucky's vision, 19th century, Bucky's vision, and the point is the computerized economy needed to be harnessed in a way that dealt with all the media, whereas Bucky Fuller still wanted to overcome the Malthusian vision of basic cornflakes for people everywhere. But when people eat information as well as food, by the 90s they're eating inadequate food because they can eat headphones and TVs and computer, which satisfies a certain sensory hunger, and that throws off the emphasis on first nature health. And that's a medical problem that their new media did that Bucky Fuller did not realize.
Yeah, right. So, well, they were both comprehensivists of a giant proportion, of which I want for now in our modern time. We don't have.
Now, wait a
people
minute.
that
Here's how we need to. Bucky was a comprehensivist of concepts.
Yeah.
McLuhan was a comprehensivist of modular environments. Different. Concepts are a product of the alphabet. Pre-alphabetic and post-alphabetic people don't have concepts; they have percepts. That's called.
Yeah, he used to talk about how much more the percept, your body percept. Yeah.
And the electric.
Well, it's getting toward a kind of
That-
a multi,
and the media extensions
and
of
that's
that.
beginning to come in the computers with parallel processing that's
Yes.
coming now. It's not going to be just all linear, strung out along an algorithm. They're going to be parallel. It's some sort of a time to be a live participant and conscious at this particular moment.
To be conscious.
Yes, it's an amazing time. You could have lived in the 10th century. It took 200 years to invent a nail. I mean,
Right.
it took forever.
Now,
But
in
listen,
this next clip, I think
okay,
we should
let's
go
set
into
it.
that.
Well, let's get a second clip.
Here
Let's
we
set
had
it
the
up.
first clip where he's really unknown in 1964, but he's going to become big. By 1968, he's here in New York. He's arguing with Norman Mailer.
He's been to Fordham already? Fordham?
It's
He's
the
been
year
with
of Fordham.
Culkin?
He's
Yeah.
at Fordham when we see
Right,
this tape.
with
It's the
Culkin,
spring of '68, and he's just finishing Fordham, and he's in a panel with Malcolm Muggeridge, the great British icon, and Norman Mailer, the American icon of that period. So here's the three of them, just talking and dealing with in a casual TV format. It's not really argumentative, though you can see that Muggeridge and Mailer are argumentative. They're literate people with points of view. And McLuhan is there, very casual, just tossing off amazing statements that are almost ignored. So I think we should
It's
go to
almost
that.
coming up to the time of Annie Hall when he appeared and came up from behind. Okay, we're going to set that up in the studio then, and we're going to run that. And it's about, I guess it's about
5 minutes.
About four or five minutes. So let's set that up and run that in the studio now. We're talking again with Tom Dobbs, archivist for the
Bob
great
Dobbs.
intellectual giant Marshall McLuhan. Set it up and run the tape now then, please. Thank you.
And Marshall McLuhan has survived a brain tumor, back at Fordham University for his year in exile as a distinguished professor, minding men's minds once more. With writer and critic Robert Fulford presiding, here they are then, the 3M Company.
Marshall, you said a few minutes ago that obscenity is a way that young people establish their identities. What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, roughhouse and roughing encounter with rough aspects of life is a great thrill for youngsters. because it does help them to get a feeling of themselves, an image of themselves, body percept. Roughhouse and rough language and rough activity, this is a great means of self-discovery. One peculiarity about obscenity, if you notice, is that whereas the individual obscene word is very involving, very tactile, very smelly, very rough-textured, it is always a part of the human body. It consists in breaking a bit off the human body, and this is a bit of violence and roughage. And just as profanity is a kind of breaking of prayer into bits, into fragments, in order to create this rough thing.
Well, Norman, you actually invented an obscenity, or came close to it. In The Naked and the Dead, you used the word fug, F-U-G.
Yes, yes.
About 400 times in that book, as I recall it.
Yep.
And it's become part of the language since then, and there's a musical group called the Fugs. And
Well, I know
so
some of my best friends are the Fugs.
But you're still involved. You're still involved. Incidentally, how do you like them using your word? I mean, didn't you copyright it or something?
They're welcome to it. The word has been a source of great embarrassment to me over the years, because you know, Tallulah Bankhead's press agent many years ago got a story in the papers which went, oh, hello, you're Norman Mailer, said Tallulah Bankhead allegedly. You're the young man who doesn't know how to spell. You know, and then the four-letter word was indicated with all sorts of asterisks. And, you know, and I became a household joke. It was the first of my notorieties. And I regretted it. I was inflamed Miss Bankhead for years as a result. I thought she should have hired a publicity man who had a better sense of fair play.
Yeah, that's right.
At any rate, the word never gave me any pleasure. I used it because I felt that it was a fair word to use to give the quality of the Army experience, which was not dramatic, which did not consist of breaking things off, of making clubs out of words, which was not used to intimidate. It was used to fill certain spaces in the thought ways that you had in the Army. In other words, it was really a way of filling gaps. It was used to give a kind of rhythm in speech. It had nothing to do with obscenity.
By the way, there is a peculiar aspect of this obscenity business, namely that nudity is not obscene. And it's only the partial, fragmented appearance of the body that is obscene.
Or titillating, even.
Yeah. Nudity, in fact, in England, I believe, Malcolm, they have a strange law that any nude on the stage, as long as it does not move.
They used to have that law.
That was the rule, but of course we've moved on to that. Now, there was the rule that if you were nude and kept absolutely still, it was okay.
Yeah, but
now,
any
there are
movement...
reasons why it's difficult to keep still if you're nude. One of them might be that it's cold.
Well, there's a fly around or something.
Right.
Malcolm, I ask a question. What would happen if you kept absolutely still, but the condition in which your nudity was discovered was...
I see what you're getting at, Norman, exactly. And I think that would have created a special problem, but as the people who were nude and kept still were all female, this trouble didn't arise.
Yes, they're all...
It was rather, wasn't it? I must say just about this, that Marshall was rather suggesting that obscenities are something that the young indulge in, but I should have thought that it was much more the old and impotent who have a taste for obscenity, and that far from seeking an identity, they were in fact trying to compensate for or stimulate appetites.
Or recapture an earlier one.
Recapture an earlier one, maybe, but I would have thought that most obscenity was in fact for the old and impotent and often produced by them. I don't think the young produce much obscenity, although they may appreciate it.
Well, they use it now, certainly children use it now as a way of putting on their parents, of getting to their parents. They know if they say certain words, their parents will have to pay attention to them. In that sense, you're finding identity. Even a 9-year-old or a 7-year-old learns this in our culture.
He's invading a mature world.
Yes, but he's establishing himself as a personality who has to have attention paid to him, even though he's...
It's a very ancient thing.
Hey, that's really something, you know, Muggeridge, and that was what year was this again?
1968.
1968,
yeah.
Right. So what was your interpretation of what they were on about there? That you were talking about it would led into it, but...
Well, the main point is that they're dealing with the identity crisis that young people are having in the media swill of the 60s. All these new environments that no generation had to live under. And how it tended for young people to emphasize obscenity and rough textures in life and identity quests more than what was seen in previous generations. situation. It was
well,
quite...
identity quest is something that if you, I come back again to a theme you and I touched upon before. Maybe it's just not fair, but we step back from that and look at things comprehensively. Chardin, or something of that sort of thing.
Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah, Teilhard, and that sort of thing. Mario Cuomo was very taken with him. You know, it's interesting, our political leader. But if you look at it, and we said it very trippingly off our tongue, that the extensions of media, the extensions of our sensory and psychic or intellectual capability that was unique to mankind, to being able to extend and create an environment in a certain sense.
A second nature.
Was, it was something that, I mean, birds make nests, but we have an ability to extend our consciousness into
and
the
to
environment,
transmit it.
create it as something other than what in an Eden-like sense was given. Mitochondrial DNA tells us we evolved 200,000 years ago, apparently out of Africa, from common ancestor. And you and I said, sort of trippingly and let it go, that we're coming to the end of that process. We're coming into a new relationship to the cosmos. Fuller recognized that we may be transcending scarcity as an ontologic reality, which is a huge thing. So the question of identity that's in the soul of mankind at this time going through, this is not the 6th century where change was going at a snail's pace. It's going exponential upon exponential. So there's no wonder that there is in the soul of mankind now a profound identity quest. It brings into question the organizing principles of all of our organizational assumptions that's coming out of history, and brings the line of James Joyce that history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken to a reality that is not just a forward-looking metaphor or something. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is a very angst-ridden time, and it should be.
Yes, it's inevitable. Now, the problem is at the end of that last segment, Marshall responds to the critic who says, well, the kids are trying to aggravate their parents.
They've always done that.
Yeah, they've always done that. That's why McLuhan says, well, this is put on. They're putting them on. Now, to relate that to what you just said, the average person now, with his laptop, puts on huge environments, huge media environments.
Huger all the time.
But miniaturized. So there's an autonomy from that. Now, basically what you have is the technology that humans made was a second nature. In theological terms, it was the second Adam in his establishment. A second nature. Now, what's happening is that this second nature is gradually getting closer to the characteristics and flexibility of first nature, the world around us, the first world, and it's going to merge with it. Now, the internet allows, and the virtualization of that stuff will allow people in their brains and in software terms to merge with first nature, but it won't actually deal with the economy. The real merging of first nature would be technologies like cold fusion, which deal with the raw first nature problems of food and shelter and warmth and clothing. If you have a free energy source, more coming out than goes in.
Well, there goes scarcity.
That's right.
As scarcity, economics is the allocation of scarce resources. If you transcend scarcity, you're in a different kind of world.
We've transcended it software-wise. People have access to all kinds of information, and they can design it their own way.
Archer Daniel Midland says, we have no problem of creating food, or you could extend that to, material things. It's just a matter of how are we going to distribute it. A political question, big political question.
But where's our identity?
But we didn't have that in the past.
You cannot be Bill Gates. That's his name, that's his identity, based on the alphabet. But before that, you had a mush of identity. It wasn't that particular to the individual. So now, when in the software environment, the kids grow up in a mushed porridge kind of environment in terms of media access, they can't develop a private identity. And they're open to group kinds of organization, but that cannot be done unless you brought in something like cold fusion and a new energy source, which would deal with the money and purse strings.
You bring in the cold fusion in the sense of having an energy system that begins to get beyond scarcity?
That's right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because...
And is that as a metaphor for scarcity in general?
Yes, we have
materials scarcity?
We have software scarcity is not a problem anymore. People can experience all kinds of things all over the world through different media. But what we don't have is first nature scarcity, warmth, shelter, and endless food, and the idea of keeping your home warm. Oil does that for now, but oil is tied in with money. If you come into a situation which is not friction-based, money is frictionless, because it's friction-based because it runs out. But if you have an energy that comes out more than's put in, you're now frictionless. That would break out of the Western legacy of private identity and visual space, which was enhanced by the printing press, and we call it money. So we have a technology that can move us out of the scarcity problem that money rides on. But software doesn't do that. That's what the rest of the world is angry about. They're saying, you're sending us software, but where are the cornflakes?
Right. Well, all right. Negroponte talks about, bits and then bytes. I mean, bits and bytes, and then on the other hand, atoms, things that actually are there. You can have an order for avian water, but you got to have the bottle, is the thing in the bottle that gets to it. So there's bits, there's moving things, actual things around, and the thing, the
atoms are first nature, bits and bytes are second nature.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. And bits and bytes offer a fusion of software situation, but it doesn't connect back with first nature.
Right. Well, that's interesting. So it's back to that thing about the information precedes the difficulty of the reality. Or
the behavior is ahead of our concepts. We're already living in a fused environment, but our concepts and our old media, which are held together by money and that private identity, are holding back a proper perception of our behavior.
Well, a proper perception as we see it in terms of the evolution of a universal consciousness and a pattern. But then that comes up to the question of history and how are we going to... It would seem to me
history is a product of writing and print. They didn't have history.
Well, there was a history before there was writing.
That was oral.
Before there was oral history.
And there was no stability, no private identity. Everybody participated in that history, and we do that today.
Well,
we participate in the news.
Yeah, I guess maybe the point I'm trying to make in a certain sense is that back again to that large picture. If we're coming to a time where there is a transcending of the conditions out of which we have emerged, out of 200,000 years, and that thing about scarcity is not a small matter. That's a huge matter.
That's the issue.
That if we have that, then we're going to have, and you have some sort of a new notion of how the society could be, world society, perhaps could be organized in terms of certain principles. It would be, first of all, that would allow for, in a certain sense, certain non-zero sum possibilities that historically were not possible. And it might make it possible for the new order to be able to present, and in fact make it incumbent upon those who are talking about some transformation, to present to those responsible for the historical institutions an alternative that isn't going to lop off their heads.
That's right.
So that we have to make a rendezvous with history that is non-zero sum and and beyond the dialectic in a certain sense. And that's a major challenge now intellectually and politically.
To say that is one medium. What you just said is speech. Now, think of the medium we're inside. Right now, we're broadcasting and having all kinds of tactile effects, plus there's millions of other media competing. The message you just put out is puny and tiny and gets lost in the swill of information. So no one good message has any staying power.
Well, I wasn't necessarily making the message as having something, other than say that that is a problem that confronts mankind.
Yes, we have a problem.
And the whole biological evolutionary process. Fuller used to say, you got, the second law of thermodynamics is all throughout the universe, and the biological process moves across entropy, or the tendency for systems to move to chaos, and that's the purpose of biological evolution, apexed by mankind, and we're coming to a time of fruition.
Entropy is friction. Neg entropy, what cold fusion brings in.
He used to call it anti-entropic.
Right.
He used to call it biological process was anti-entropic.
They are.
And so
as our technology approximates the anti-entropic of first nature and biology, that can only be done by something like cold fusion. Software doesn't do it. Cold fusion merges because it creates more energy than there's no friction.
It's
anti-entropic.
That's a bridge to the world of the atom.
That's right, back to the atom, or ADAM.
So we got the design, but we need some sort of a way of getting back to the real world of the atom and so forth.
That's the phrase in Finnegan's Wake, abnihilization of the atom, E-T-Y-M. But abnihilization doesn't mean the wiping out, it's the putting aside, which brings up the tetrad, McLuhan's final scientific principle, where every new technology enhances something, obsolesces, old technology retrieves an old technology that has been forgotten, and then flips into something with opposite characteristics. That's the abnihilization of the atom, and I come back full circle. That's what Joyce said. He understood the tetrad, and McLuhan turned it into a literate scientist.
The tetrahedron.
Tetrahedron, Bucky Fuller.
Bucky Fuller. It was a pleasure. Sorry, we could have gone talking. We will off camera later, but it's been your pleasure to have perceptions in Bob Dobbs. He's the official archivist of Marshall McLuhan, intellectual giant of our time. Bob, thanks really very, very much for coming in. It's been your pleasure to have his perceptions. We invite you to tune in conversation. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for now. Bob, thanks a lot for coming in, bringing the tape and so forth, and look forward to an ongoing communication with you as we
it's to your credit having me on and presenting the real McLuhan as close as we could get to.
Well, he was a giant, and if only I wish we had the likes at the moment we are talking now.
We do have the tapes.
Yes, we do indeed. We have tapes, and there's much more, right?
Yes.
Once again, thanks for viewing. We'll be back again next week. And again, Bob, thank you very much indeed. Until next time. Boy, there's a lot to talk about.
There's a lot that's implied.
Yeah, you were living in Toronto then?
Yeah, I lived in Toronto from 77 to 93, But before that, I was living in Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada, but spent a lot of time in
you know
Toronto.
Gordon? He's up in Nova Scotia. The fellow who wrote
I don't know. I know his person who works with him.
That's a good book.
You know why that got written?
Right.
Is that Gordon did one of these quickie Understanding McLuhan for Beginners book, and the McLuhan family saw it and said, this guy understands Marshall, so they invited him to do the official biography.
It's good to be able to take ideas. As somebody who can take ideas and put them in a way that can be understood by a broad consciousness is really an important function, and the youth and that kind of stuff. You know, and some of the possible.
Here's the thing about that. You got Philip Marchand's biography, which came out 10 years ago.
Right.
That shows the emotional drama of Marshall's life and some of the basic percepts. But Gordon's book is good because it's more academic and goes into the scholarly background of Marshall.
Right.
It doesn't show the emotional drama of Marshall's life as much. It gives you the ideas.
Right.
Put those two biographies together.